It's time now for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to both President Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good morning, all. Craig, I want to start with you. You know, I think most Americans, and I would include myself in that group, have somewhat of a moral certitude about Ukraine. Probably the first time in my life where I feel like this is so crystal clear to me that we have to push back against the Russians. And yet Ron DeSantis has now questioned whether or not we should be so intertwined there. What is the politics of the Ukraine for Joe Biden and for the country?
You know, all very good points and a good question. First of all, I'm kind of where you are. It's pretty clear to me that, you know, the U.S. standing up against this unbelievable, horrific, intrusion and an assault on Ukraine by Vladimir Putin is exactly the appropriate thing to do. It almost seems to rise above politics. I wish that were the case, but it's falling prey to politics. I think for President Biden, he is in this, and it's something that he's going to follow through on because he believes it's the right thing to do. If there's a political price to be paid, my guess is he'll pay it. I'm not sure there's a price to be paid. As someone was pointing out, I think McConnell maybe, pay attention to the leaders in the House and the Senate who sit on these committees on a bipartisan basis, and you hear very different rhetoric than you hear from those voices who kind of read the polls and decide in the morning where they want to land. And the polling is probably as much an issue here as anything. The polling suggests that there's been a reduction of support. That's entirely to be expected. Americans grow impatient with conflict, even though our troops aren't on the ground for the most part. They grow impatient as these things go on. It's costly, and so support does tend to fall, and it can rise again. But it's the sort of thing that DeSantis and some other Republicans have seized upon to try to differentiate themselves from the president. It's, you know that I'm not the one to be cynical, but I really find and am greatly disappointed in the approach DeSantis has taken. Ron DeSantis was critical of the Obama administration for not doing more to help Ukraine. Ron DeSantis said if we were giving the Ukrainians more of what they needed, Vladimir Putin would fear, going into a conflict there. Ron DeSantis, literally only a few years ago was on the other side of this issue. He was for aiding Ukraine until he was against it. And I think he has a political price to pay, frankly, for trying to be on both sides of this issue based upon what the polling says. And I really think it would behoove him to have a more reasoned and thoughtful approach. I just don't think that when it comes to foreign policy, that reading the polls and deciding where you stand makes a whole lot of sense. It should be pointed out, Nikki Haley, who has far more foreign policy experience than Ron DeSantis, says this is really a battle for freedom. I mean, she's staked out a position that is far more, I would say, consistent with what American foreign policy is today and what it ought to be. Whether that differentiates her among Republicans from DeSantis, time will tell. But right now, I think mostly DeSantis is reading the polls and trying to land where he thinks a majority of his supporters might be found.
Al, this war will cost the United States a lot of money. We're all very bullish, I would say, right now. But as the costs increase, don't you feel like the Republicans might have something there?
Not much. I think the Republicans ought to listen to Craig and me. Let's just sit back and put this in a little perspective. Here's President Biden acting in his capacity of leader of the free world, taking an historic and courageous trip into a dangerous war zone to underscore our commitment to democracy and our willingness to defend it, and to stop really the greatest threat to democracy and freedom in Europe and in the world since World War II. To get there, he needs to take a 10-hour train trip without U.S. troops on the ground to protect him. I dare say Donald Trump and or Ron DeSantis probably would not have the courage to do that, but that's just my guess. In any event, it's the first time a United States president has gone to an active war zone that was not controlled by U.S. troops since the Civil War. That's pretty historic, and it's gained the admiration of most Americans, including most Republicans like Mitch McConnell. DeSantis has chosen to act not as a future leader of the nation, but as he's trying to act out in his role as mini Trump, instinctively opposing whatever Biden does, even when Biden does the right thing. So his response has really been to echo Russian talking points. He says, Russia's not a threat to anybody, which seems to be painfully, obviously wrong to anybody who's watched a war going on because of a Russian invasion of a free country, Ukraine, for over a year, or for a year now, actually a year tomorrow. So what he's decided to do is in the worldwide struggle for democracy and freedom, and between democracy and autocracy, he's decided to come down on the wrong side. Now that's wrong morally, it's wrong substantively, and I believe it's pretty short-sighted politically, and as Craig said, and just basically wrong. Candidates who play that kind of petty party, partisan primary politics usually get in trouble. And I think DeSantis is digging a hole now that it's going to be hard for him to escape from in a general election. He might get by in the Republican primaries, get a pass from the Trump base, but in a general election, that noose is going to be pulled pretty tightly around his neck. And he ought to talk to Craig Fuller about that, because Craig's an expert on this. In 1988, Michael Dukakis, who I always confused DeSantis with, said some things in the primaries that George Herbert Walker Bush used to define him in the general election. And that took a 17-point lead Dukakis had out of the Democratic convention and turned it into a 41-state Bush landslide. So he ought to talk to Fuller about that. But he could also learn a little bit from the 1992 campaign. That actually was the biggest lesson we took into 1992. We knew we had to frame the 1992 race. So when George Bush prosecutes a successful war in the first Gulf War, you didn't see Bill Clinton coming out against it. He supported it because he wanted to take that off the table so he could fight on issues on his own terms. And that's what we did. I wrote about that extensively in my book. It was the single most important part of our political strategy. Yeah. So I'd tell Ron DeSantis, you ought to recant. You ought to go back to your original position. I don't think the United States and Russia are going to be allies next year. And you can dig yourself such a deep hole in the primary that even if you think you're coming out strong out of your convention, by the time the general election is done, you're going to be in deep doo-doo, to quote George Herbert Walker Bush.
Well, Craig, I want you to respond, but maybe quickly, and then I have another subject I'd like to talk to you about.
Points. And the only thing I would add, which is even more confounding, is the campaigns for presidency are not usually lost on foreign policy. It's all about the pocketbook issues. It's on what is affecting people in their everyday lives, and especially when we don't put a large number of troops into a military conflict. So DeSantis is flip-flopping on something that in the end, the substance of it may not matter as much as the fact that he is playing politics with serious foreign policy. And I do think I agree with the phrase, it's a rookie mistake. The person probably most pleased with all of this is Nikki Haley, because it does give her a chance to drive a little bit of a wedge in the DeSantis-Trump camp and her own campaign.
I do want to change subjects and talk about Senator Fetterman's decision to treat depression. I think we're all having some flashback to the McGovern campaign and Tom Eagleton at the time, who was actually, it was terminal for the McGovern campaign. But this is 2023, and but it is leaving some political challenges for both Senator Fetterman and Pennsylvania Democrats. What's your take on that?
First of all, I only wish Senator Fetterman the best. This is a serious healthcare problem. It affects millions of Americans. It needs to be treated. Depression is debilitating for individuals that suffer from it, and can, as we all too often learn, be something that's fatal. So I think the fact that he is publicly disclosing what he's going through and he's getting treatment for it is an altogether positive development. And I hope coming out of this, he has a measure of relief and a means for coping with this healthcare challenge that he faces. The question as to whether somebody who has health issues, serious health issues, ought to get into a campaign in the first place is a legitimate question. And I think I have great respect for people from both parties, who choose to seek public office and serve their community and their country as a public official. But it is extraordinarily demanding. And I think that the individual who's seeking office and those around him or her really need to consider the consequences of taking a step when you have any kind of healthcare issue. But the pressures on individuals today are enormous. The environment in which Senator Fetterman found himself is one riddled with conflict and a challenge and emotional stresses, and that's not something for someone to go into. I think I guess time will tell how it's going to sort itself out. He may decide he can continue. Some people with health issues certainly resolve those and continue. Other people step away. But I do think candidates and I do think voters ought to look at this, and there's a lesson here that we ought to be very careful who we nominate to run for these positions and who we elect.
Al, you have the last word.
Our 2023 is not 1972. We've come a long way in understanding an awful lot about healthcare, and particularly about mental health, in the last half century. And I too admire Fetterman for seeking treatment. I think he has a very difficult road ahead. I was very nervous during the campaign. In fact, I think I probably picked his opponent to win, Mehmet Oz, because I thought Fetterman was had a hard time, was recovering from his stroke, particularly in the debate, showed that he had a long way to go. And I think Oz, who was a doctor, reacted about as poorly as you could to it, and probably helped what otherwise would have been a performance that would have hurt Fetterman greatly. It must have been an almost killing exercise for him to perform well enough, just marginally well enough, to win the election. And I think he probably underestimated the distance he had to go to be fully healthy, and, as Craig said, the pressures of being a public official. I hope he can come out of this okay, but I think it's going to be a pretty rough road ahead.
We have to leave it there. Al Fromm, Craig Fuller, thank you so much indeed. We will see you next week.